Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Carol Collins, the lucky editor at Norton Books in Education, who worked with Debbie Zakarian and Ivania Soto on their beautiful book, Responsible Schooling for Culturally and Linguistically Diverse Students. We're so pleased to see so many of you here and so proud to sponsor this presentation with EdWeb. By way of background, W.W. Norton is the largest independent and employee-owned publisher in the U.S., and our rapidly growing line of professional development books for K-12 teachers and administrators is designed to help educators meet the challenges of teaching with confidence and joy. We welcome you to browse our latest catalog and are happy to offer 20% off these books to viewers of this webinar. Of course, you can view our entire list of offerings on our website, and we also welcome you to follow us on social media and visit our blog, k12talk.com. The topic of responsive schooling for diverse students is always important, but never more so in these days of a pandemic that has magnified the inequities in our educational system. The two terrific women scholars and educators who wrote Responsive Schooling for Culturally and Linguistically Diverse Students have complementary backgrounds and expertise that inform the content of the book. Dr. Soto, who unfortunately can't be with us today for the webinar, is Professor of Education and Director of Graduate Programs at Whittier College, having previously served the LAUSD district as a teacher of English and English language development, as well as a literacy coach and administrator. She's authored many books about English learners and currently serves as Director of the Institute for Culturally and Linguistically Responsive Teaching at Whittier. Debbie Zakarian, who is with us today, is also a prolific author. I think the current count might be 11 and counting. You can correct me if I got that wrong, Debbie. And has over 3 decades experience as a district administrator, university faculty member, and educational service agency leader. Her consulting work across the U.S. is focused on leadership and instructional practices with diverse learners, including English learners, academic language learners, and students living with diversity. Debbie, fortunately, is with us today, so without further ado, let me turn the webinar over to her. Having had a sneak peek, I can tell you you're in for a wonderful presentation. So, Debbie, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Carol, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be with you and to have co-written this book with Ivania, a wonderful scholar as well. And Ivania's on the West Coast, I'm on the East Coast, and a lot of the work that we bring combines our scholarship to this wonderful topic of responsive schools. Today, I'm really grateful that our publisher Norton is doing this, especially during the pandemic, where we're all working and thinking and living at home and working remotely. And some of us are doing a hybrid of both, and others of us are working back in schools. So today we're here to talk about a very important topic of responsive schools and the steps we need to make sure that students and families are really empowered and are active and empowered contributors to all that we do. So a way to get started is to look at, what's the urgency? And I'm also going to be looking at how can we help everyone be strong, resilient, and especially to our ever-changing, dynamically ever-changing student and family populations. And in thinking about that, why should we use a strength-based approach? And what are some key essential tenets that we use in the book that are really helpful to think about when we talk about responsive schools? So I'm going to start with the urgency, and you've got the chat box. I see lots of people from all over the country and elsewhere chiming in to say, hey, I'm from here. So I want to ask some questions about what's the urgency and really frame it around. I'm going to share some information and just write in the chat box how this information relates to your thinking around what you're experiencing. So here's some first thoughts about, what's the urgency for responsive schools. And a very first one is that multilingual, multicultural students and their families are one of the fastest growing groups in the United States and are among the most diverse racially, socioeconomically, culturally, and linguistically. So think about your own context and how it's changed. So, what's the urgency that you're feeling around responsive schools? And then let me give you a second point to think about. And that is, in addition to, students and families growing, many multilingual, multicultural students and families, literacy experiences and prior schooling is very distinct from ours. So, how does that relate to what you've been experiencing, that factor? And then I've done a lot of research and writing on students living with trauma, violence, and chronic stress. And that's a really important topic. Before the pandemic, the National Survey of Children's Health shared with us that half of the nation's students are living with trauma, violence, and chronic stress. So, how does that factor impact your thinking about teaching students from uh, with responsive schools? And what I mean is students who've experienced abuse, neglect, or household challenges, such as a parent who's incarcerated, a family member who died, or someone who's addicted to drugs. How has that impacted your thinking about, being responsive? The other is multilingual, multicultural students. If half the nation have experienced this, what about multilingual, multicultural students? And in reality, they experience the same adversities as the nation's students. However, there's an and. And the thing is, and they've also experienced, many of them at least, coming from countries where they've experienced civil strife, war, natural disasters, and many have come here as undocumented students or citizens and fear deportation themselves. The other is many English learners, or what we call multilingual learners, live in deep poverty. In fact, in studies that have been done, 60% of all English learners live 185% below the poverty level. So when we think about responsive schooling, how do these factors relate to our work? And so you can write about that in the chat box. And like one person wrote, which is, I acknowledge that many are working with diverse families and are really looking for answers around what's the best way to go, which is, a great thing to share. And others echo saying, I'm experiencing the same thing. So let's look a little bit more at this by looking at how this information applies to us as educators. And that's an important thing to consider too as we think about being responsive. So, as we think about the urgency, it's really helpful to think about ourselves. And here are some factors that are really helpful to think about. And you can write in the chat box about how these apply to you or apply to your context. So, first, most teachers and administrators are white and middle class. So, what's your experience been? Second, most of us have been trained in teacher education programs by white middle class faculty who haven't had the depth of background around cultural and linguistic diversity that we know is needed. So, what was your experience as a teacher in training? And then there's a factor about our nation's suburban schools. In fact, suburban schools are rapidly becoming more culturally and linguistically diverse at such a pace that there are institutes about teaching multilingual learners from metropolitan suburb areas and so forth. And those students are spreading out into more rural, more suburban and rural communities. So when we look at that closely, what do we find? That most multicultural, multilingual students representing these suburbs are living in isolated areas away from their peers and their teachers, which adds a layer of complexity. And some of us are saying, yeah, in the chat box, I'm saying, yes, that's true. I see that a lot of the teachers are this. And so further, all too often, it leads to this feeling and this perception that multilingual, multicultural students either don't know English, they've been in an English learner program too long, they should have learned English, they haven't been to school, so how can I help them? their parents are too poor to help, or they can't help because they don't speak English, or their life is too chaotic to help us. So, if, just think about that. Have you been in situations where that's been your case? And the big thing is these deficit based perceptions make us feel like we're Sisyphus pushing up that big ball up a hill, and it's just not going to work. And I see that in our chat box. A lot of people are writing about that. We're either the we're the member of a group that our multilingual, multicultural students represent, or maybe we're in a school district with low incidence of such students and we feel like we're advocating for them. But we can also feel a great sense of responsibility, and it can make us feel compassion fatigue that we're working hard, but the situation is impossible. Have you felt that way in your work? And how does that apply to you? So, here's a way of thinking about it, and there's great research which says, wait a minute, let's think anew. And that is this wonderful research base that's occurred. It is, let's look at the research. For years, the field of psychology, psychiatry, and social work told us to look at what was wrong and treat the problem. Like the pieces of broken glass on the left of the slide, it was look at what's broken in the lives of students and families and treat the problem. However, what was found was that focusing on what was wrong led to deficit-based outcomes. Students didn't do well, they didn't graduate, they weren't successful in school, high dropout rates, and so forth. So it also led to that perception that we have where we feel that the situation is so impossible, we can't possibly help students. But look on the right of the slide because there's very promising news. In the past several decades, what we've learned is that when we take the time to shift our patterns of thinking away from what we perceive as wrong to the many assets and strengths that students and their families possess, and we too, when we take time to do that, students have a much better chance of succeeding in school and flourishing in their lives. So that's what we want to look at. How do we use a strength based approach that helps students build that wonderful mosaic of experiences that's uniquely theirs and that they can draw on for the rest of their lives, like the mosaic here? So I want to look at that a little bit by talking about Dr. Fauci. Anthony Fauci on April 7th, a few weeks after much of the nation's schools closed and the globe, our world closed, he said that the pandemic, and I'm quoting him, shines a very bright light on some of the real weaknesses and foibles of our society, namely that a disproportionate number of students and families and others are at a much higher risk of contracting the virus and dying from it because of chronic injustices and inequities that have plagued our nation and elsewhere for decades and generations. An example of what Dr. Fauci shared that I want to share with you is the Brockton Public Schools in Massachusetts. Brockton had one of the highest incidences of COVID-19 in the state. And when the governor of Massachusetts ordered that all schools in the state, private, public, everyone, close, Brockton quickly launched a proactive effort to make sure that its students not only continued getting their free breakfast and free lunch, but they started a bag and go breakfast and lunch program where within the short span of 2 days, schools closed on Friday. On Monday, they had 10 different locations in the city that made sure that students continued to be fed. It also purchased smartphones, knowing that families would need contact. It purchased smartphones for its team of bilingual, bicultural parent advocates, adjustment counselors, nurses, paraprofessionals, so that they would be able to continue the type of one-to-one contacts that they had before the pandemic. It also launched a call center that was supported by volunteer nurses and adjustment counselors. And they opened it up to staff as well as families because everyone in the city knew someone who had COVID-19, had died from COVID-19. It was a pretty significantly seriously impacted city. Now, grant funding has enabled Brockton to purchase computers for every child, have MiFi internet access so that students can be able to access their learning. And one of the comments that Kelly Jones, the director of its English Learner Programming, shares is that because of this wonderful access, every student that she's learned about has not just gained access to the computer, but they've become very tech savvy. So that when we think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and we talk about, what do students need? Brockton is a wonderful example. They addressed its students' physiological needs. They addressed their assets and capacities. They really brought together this approach to care for the safety of its students, the sense of community and respect. And Maslow, which a lot of us may not be aware of, is that his hierarchy of needs, he also coined another term, which is called positive psychology. So with Maslow's thinking, just think about the power of Brockton and what it was able to do. So let's look a little bit more at Brockton High School. I think you'll like this example. A strength-based approach really includes one where students and families are empowered to leverage their cultural and linguistic and their other assets. So think about this as I explain what Brockton's High School did. This was before the pandemic, what it developed, and write your thoughts and ideas in the chat box about how does this inspire you? So just to give you a little background, close to 41% of Brockton High School have families whose first language is in English. And a little over 58% of its students are learning English. And they're from really all over the world, but their highest incidence come from Cape Verde, Haiti, and Spanish-speaking countries. So as the cities become more and more diverse, the need for medical interpreters and translators grew. In response, Brockton High School implemented a medical translation and interpretation and translation certification program for its students. The students in their junior and senior year take courses on the art of communicating, bedside manner, in actual situations, and they take courses in anatomy and physiology and human systems. And in the spring of their senior year, they intern at Brockton Neighborhood Community Center. According to its coordinator, Rachel Umbriana, in the past 4 years, Brockton Neighborhood Health Center has hired many graduates of the program as full-time medical interpreters, and the translator program continues as one of the greatest highlights of the high school and who Brockton Neighborhood Health Center goes to when they need such support. This photo is the graduation ceremony from one of those years. So how does that inspire you? One of you said, I wish I could take that class. Wouldn't that be wonderful? And someone else said, oh, I'm interested in that. I think it's a great program. I agree. And if you wish, we wrote about it in this book, so you can learn a lot about how Brockton did it. So let's look at something else, and that is a student's first language. So think of the positives of students expressing or being able to express their thoughts, feeling, and ideas in their home language, and what might be missed if we don't include that strength. So I'm going to share with you an award-winning or a snippet from an award-winning video from the Dearborn Public Schools in Dearborn, Michigan, and have a look at this video. And as you're looking at it, think of these positives of being able to use our students' first language. So here's the video.
With a teacher who speaks her language in the classroom, Henna can discuss the fate of Wilbur, the pig in Charlotte's Web. even though Henna has just begun to learn English.
يعني إنه كان يشتهي يذبحه كان أول بنت يشتهي يذبحها بس بعدين هي دافعت عليه وما رضيت يعني ما بدها.
The other advantage of Ms. Al-Qadi speaking Henna's home language is that she can build a relationship more quickly with Henna. Like Nabila and a lot of Henna's classmates, Henna's here in Dearborn because of the war that has been raging in Yemen since 2015. Henna currently lives with her father and two brothers, but her mother is still waiting for a chance to join her family.
أنا لما كنت يعني في اليمن كنت عايشة ومبسوطة وفرحة يعني يوم أمي معي وكل الناس معي بس بعدين لما أنا جيت هون أمريكا حسيت إني فارقتهم كلهم وفقدت الأمل. يعني كيف قلش حسيت إني وحيدة.
You have to build that personal connection in order for you to like really, I guess, be impactful to your students, in order for them to want to come to school every day, because that's a big piece of it too, you know. I think if you make that personal connection with those kids, you know, then they know who to turn to when they need to turn to someone.
This video was made possible by a generous grant from the American Federation of Teachers.
So you've written quite a bit. What a brave young lady, someone says. She should be teaching us, and I fully agree. I just think that video is wonderful. And it comes to us from Colorine, Colorado, as you saw on the left-hand side. And you can see the full video if you log on to Colorine, Colorado. So I want to move on with this idea. Thank you for watching that video. And boy, is it exceptional. To this idea of, you know, with the Brockton Public High School and You Are Welcome Here, Dearborn, why it's so inspirational. And part of our thinking has to be that learning is a sociocultural process that requires that what we teach really is linked with who we teach. And, you know, who we teach really has to be connected with our students' sociocultural, linguistic, academic, and our capacity to think about what we're thinking about and be able to express it, or what we call that cognitive piece. And a great example that Ivania and I use in the book is a mathematics one that involves distance, rate, and time. Maybe you remember that from you were in school yourself. And we highlight a student who's taken the train from Newark to New York City many times with this family. He's visited Times Square. One time he went to see the National Puerto Rican Day Parade and to see the top of the Empire State Building. So when he's learning the math formula for measuring, you know, how fast a train travels from one destination to another, he's really able to do that problem pretty quickly because it's something he's experienced in his personal, his cultural, his life experience, and so forth. So, you know, when we think about that, he's had that experience. But learning is also a linguistic process, and it's an academic and a social process as well. Like the mathematical formula you see here, it's not likely to be used outside of class. It's likely that he's only going to be using it in an academic situation, not in a social one. And it's one of those that's relates specifically to math. So it's, again, you know, an experience that will occur in school, but only likely in his math class. So let's say the same student is an emerging bilingual student who speaks Spanish. Well, he's freely able to connect not just his personal, his social, his cultural experience, but his language experience. And he's able to express his thoughts freely, his thinking freely. Those four elements are really important when it comes to thinking about how we can be the most responsive to students in helping them learn. And a wonderful example or a way of illustrating this is probably with the most well-known researchers, Virginia Collier and Wayne Thomas, who are really known for their long-term studies on language learning. And they talk about a study that they did in North Carolina in 7 districts that had dual language programs. And what made them really important to think about is all of these 7 districts employed 3 critical elements. A first one was they had a K-12 commitment to students' language and culture. Another one is they separately provided instruction in both languages. And a third is not only did they provide it, but half of the time students were instructed in their home language, and the second half were instructed in their target language. And they used a phrase to describe their research of how well students did. And they said this program was astoundingly effective. And that's really, really an important factor to think about. How can we employ all of these elements into our teaching? So one of the reasons that they also indicate that the program was effective is interactions, and a lot of them. So I want to talk about that, this concept of interaction. And that is, with multilingual, multicultural students, one of the greatest barriers to learning is exposure to having a lot of interactions, and the need for students to have lots of them as they build and build from their strengths. So one of the ways that we explain this is that the more we study this concept of interactions, the more we realize how important that is and what a role it plays. And if you look at this graphic here, and I'm sharing this with you, it's in our book, but I'm sharing this with you, is when a child is born, typically the first people that child meets are his parents and guardians. And they love that child, and they bond with that child by their interactions with that child. And then it's their siblings, and as they grow, whether it's two-parent home, single-parent home, foster parent home, grandparent home, whatever it is, students, little children, little newborns learn from having interactions with others. And as they develop and become more exposed to their family's neighborhood, their places of worship, the markets they shop in, more and more interactions happen that they either observe or experience themselves, and then they come to us. And when they come to us, families expect that we're going to care for and care about their children as they've been cared for at home. And so this important concept of helping students interact is really important, especially when it comes to the very many interactions that most students have with their school and their local community and beyond, that ever expanding, ever growing interactions. So a way of really looking at it, in our book, we give it a lot of examples, and this is one of them. And it's a bedtime ritual. So as you hear this bedtime ritual, think about how it's familiar and different from what you've experienced. And maybe some of us can write about how this is really familiar. So this is a child, Anna, who she and her family have moved for the first time to a homeless shelter, where it's the very first time that they're in a publicly observed living situation. And her mother wants Anna to experience the same bedtime ritual that Anna's always experienced. So she puts her child to the cot that she's been given, and she says, "We're going to share that story." And Anna says, "Oh, tell me the vase story." And Anna's mother says, "Oh, that's a good one. My sister dropped it all right." And Anna responds, "Yes, that one. And her mother says, "Okay. When I was really little, about your age, I played with my sister. She's older than me, And Anna, who's just about 5 years old, says, yes, tell me that story." And then Anna's mother says, "Well, my mother said, don't you go near that vase." And Anna helps her continue the story by saying, "Yep, don't do that." So think about that bedtime ritual. How is it familiar to what you've engaged in, or what your children have engaged in with you? And then in the book, we also explain two other little scenarios. One where a child is being raised by their grandmother, and she sings that familiar song from their church at night when she puts her to sleep. And another one we explain is this child, Mateo, who runs to the bookcase, gets to pick out whatever book he wants, and his parents read to him at night. So all of these wonderful rituals really represent the types of interactions that these young 5-year-old children have had, and then they come to us. So let's talk about when Anna comes to school. So she comes to our kindergarten, and her teacher asks her about the field trip notice that the class is going to engage in a socially distanced way because Anna hasn't turned it in. And she asks Anna, "Where's the field trip notice?" And Anna responds, "It be at home." Now, rather than view this as a deficit-based response from Anna because she didn't use the proper form of the verb be, her teacher knows that Anna really understood the question very, very well, and they brainstorm ideas that will help Anna get that field trip notice signed. So you see the central features of a responsive classroom, which are presented here, lead to our critical awareness of our students so that we can make positive connections with them. We reference scholars Geneva Gay and Gloria Ladson-Billings to highlight the importance of seeing culture and language differences as assets, to create a learning community where students are wholly valued for who they are and the assets they bring to us, so that we can make our classrooms, our schools, and our communities even stronger. So these are foundational and require us to use a balanced approach. So I want to talk about that a little bit. One of you wrote, my dad used to take us to the public library to get books. And I'm smiling because that's exactly what my mother did. I used to come home with the same pile of books that she did. I wanted to model literacy like her. And as I aged up, I learned, how much of a literacy experience that was. So I'm going to talk about a balanced approach. And I want to talk about that from the sense of we're balancing a lot now. I mean, when you think about all that we've accomplished since last March, let me share with you what a balanced approach calls for. First, it calls for us to be flexible by continuously adjusting ourselves to all the changes that happen, especially in our dynamically changing student and family populations, the curriculum we teach, and society itself. Just think about all of the dramatic changes we've all made teaching in the face of a global pandemic. And, way last year, when we might have had many face-to-face interactions with our students throughout the school day, many of us are teaching remotely, which is a wholly new experience. So we've really got to balance, how do we create those important interactions with students, scale up those interactions, because we know how important that is to learning. So let's look at that a little bit. And I want to talk about Stephen Wang, this great student that we talk about in our book. So I'm going to ask you to share what you think we all gain by understanding culture as a way of being, okay? So I'm going to share this about Stephen. Though Stephen is primarily a speaker of English, in fact, he was born in America, generally only speaks English. The only little bit of Mandarin that he speaks is when his family either speaks on the phone with his grandparents or he's been to Taiwan to visit them. And his second language might be described as at the beginning level. But his family engages in a lot of cultural practices, heritage practices from their home country. So these include that it's important not to lose face with anyone, not to be embarrassed or embarrass anyone, and not to be harmonious at all times. So his mom is a master seamstress. He's observed her making amazing dresses and coats and all kinds of creations. And when he and his mom go to Joann's Fabrics so that she can purchase some items for her work, the salesperson tries to tell his mom that she should be purchasing alternate goods. And what does his mother say? His mother says to the salesperson, "You the expert, I'm okay." Indeed, the polite way of speaking is the one his mother engaged, and that's what Stephen's witnessed his whole life. He never varies from that. So when he took the state mathematics exam, he thought he did really well. And then he got the state results and he found out he didn't do well. In fact, he did quite poorly. And his teacher and his guidance counselor got together to look at his math results. And what they noticed was that he skipped a lot of problems. So they met with him and they said, why did you skip so many problems? And Stephen's response was, well, if I guessed, it would make me look bad. Making mistakes is not a good thing. It's not good for you either. As my teacher, I don't want to make you look bad. So think about that. Think about Stephen and what his cultural way of being is. And I'm seeing that, boy, do we have, one of you commented, boy, this is a way to learn, isn't it, about our students' culture. So let me share with you what his teacher did. And that this is a great example. His teacher used a balanced approach. She said to Stephen, look it, I want to meet with you and I want to help you understand why it's so important to make an educated guess. But tell me about you. And she learned through asking questions about what his interests were, what his aspirations are, that Stephen is really worried about the climate and his dream is to go to college and major in environmental studies. So, being the culturally responsive teacher she is, she finds out Stephen's assets and strengths, starts creating math problems that involve that climate interest of his. She looks at the content of what he needs to use, matches that with who he is as a person, his personal, social, cultural interests, and she teaches to the whole student. She even examines, boy, this might be good. Let me share with Stephen how mathematicians make mistakes and how they learn through those. So through all of that, you can see this formula. Take the content, match it with exactly what we learn about our students, and then we have a much better chance of being able to teach successfully because we've gotten to know them so well. So another aspect as well is that responsive schools really require everyone to be in partnership together so that we can help our students, our families, and ourselves feel safe, a sense of belonging, and membership to our schools. So I'm going to share with you a wonderful contributor from the book and talk about the work that she did to build partnerships with families. And I think I'm referring to someone who might be here in the chat box. I'm talking about Sue Stanley from Salina Elementary School, who generously contributed this example from the book. So I'm going to read it. Here's what Sue said. She said, I replaced a highly respected and loved elementary principal who retired after many, many years in the district. She's an Arab American woman who knew the community, was fluent in speaking and writing in Arabic. And let me show you a picture of Sue here. I'm going to show that. So here's Sue, where 98% of the population is Yemeni, 94% are English learners. Most parents don't speak English. And truth be known, she was pretty worried about her work. Sue says, I was hired in late May. I knew I had a few months to begin getting to know the families, especially because I'm a white woman from Italian and Scottish descent. I met with a community group, including the superintendent, someone from Access, which is the Arab American Community Service Agency, and other stakeholders. I invited staff to meet with me and held a popsicles with the principal meeting on the playground a month before school started. I spent a lot of time out in the community. And when the school year started, I continued that meeting with parents. But I also began a bedtime stories with Mrs. Stanley, where she went into homes by invitation only, read students a book, and left the book with them. And she continued that up until COVID. And then COVID happened. And I asked Sue about it. And what Sue said is that since COVID, she wants to share with us that the partnerships that she built and has continued to build have really greatly helped her to work closely with the community and all of the supports and resources available, including the community liaison person, Amal Kayed. Wonderful story about Principal Stanley. So let's look a little bit closely about partnerships. In the book, we call them co-powerment. Partnerships can only be realized when we draw from the assets and strengths of everyone. And that is when we want to build that sense of safety, acknowledgement, and competence that we all can really help and do help our students flourish in school. So we use this example in our book of this key feature being to help us all understand how we can support the resources and assets of our students and their families and ourselves too, by looking closely at what are the needs and desires of students and what would that look like. And when we move away from being like a hierarchical top down or something, but when we work in partnership together, how can we really help that happen? And some of you are writing about individual students that you've worked with and really helped address those needs, which is great. So I want to have us look at another school, the Wolf Street Academy, a public school in Baltimore, Maryland, where its principal talks about a crisis and how partnerships were really important for him to really and show us or demonstrate for us how partnerships with the families and the community can really help when we work toward positive change together. So we're going to look at this video from Wolf Street School.
2 years ago, for the first time in my time here at Wolf, there was a shooting outside of the school. It was right across the street from the school, completely uninvolved with anybody specifically from the school, but right in the middle of our community. We had kids out on the playground at the time. But one of the results of that crisis was that our now president of the PTO got people together and formed a parent action group. And from that action, an officer was assigned to us during the winter months to be here at dismissal time. We dismiss at 5:30. It's already dark or very close to it. And so an officer just comes and he hangs out on the corner. He's the epitome of officer friendly. He's saying hello to everybody, and the community got to know him. That kind of leadership, we talk about leadership with selling hot chocolate in the morning. That kind of leadership is what also really builds an empowered populace.
Pretty wonderful what they were able to do. And just think of that parent really recommending that this officer, that parent action group, and what they did to really help that happen. So let's look a little bit more at Wolf Street. And this, again, you can find on the Coloring Colorado site. And at one time, when Wolf Street began, many students were in need of dental care. And what is really helpful with a responsive school is to find a partner who is as strength-based as you or we want to be. So Wolf Street looked for partners, and they found partners in the University of Maryland School of Dentistry. They partnered with Wolf Street Academy and initially provided dental care. It led to nutrition care, health care classes, all kinds of partnerships with students learning about health and nutrition, partnering with dental interns that came in, some of them learning about the instruments and really becoming empowered. Since the pandemic has happened, Wolf Street also offers many after-school and out-of-school activities. And I communicated with Leah Beachley, the after-school director, and I asked her, what's Wolf Street doing now? And what she shares, Leah shared with me that Wolf Street has created a myriad of after-school activities which go along with that idea of interactions, and lots of them. They offer remotely robotics, yoga, art, theater, and debate. They show us what's possible when we are co-powered as students, parents, and the community of what's possible when we really work from everyone's assets and strengths. So think about this. What would you like to do in your particular context to ensure that parents and your local community are co-powered? So just jot down a few ideas in the chat box. Oh gosh, lots of you are sharing ideas here in the chat box. One of you writes, let's share the resources here with others. And wouldn't that be great if you share? And I wanted to use openly available or open resources, which Coloring Colorado is. So this is a wonderful resource that all of us can use, which is great. Yes, and sharing with cultures, that's a wonderful idea too. We can engage parents in a lot of opportunities online, and remotely or in person or by phone. Some of us are back in school, which whatever works is great. And you've got some parent technology classes. That's a great idea. Cultural day at school. That's a great idea. Okay, so let's go to this idea. And that is, before we open this up to questions, which is always wonderful, think about what 2 ideas you want to embrace to build your unique mosaic of embracing the idea of, or strengthening our idea of, responsive schooling for culturally and linguistically diverse students. You can post that in the chat box. And an even wonderful idea is to write it down or email it to yourself, and then open that email a week or two just to see your own growth on this journey of creating responsive schools. So now I'll turn it back to Carol, and we'll look at some questions that you've shared. Carol?
Hi. Well, that was wonderful. And I can see that we have a very engaged group here with all kinds of responses and questions to ask, and all kinds of diversity represented in the schools, including places with 45 languages and all sorts of diversity represented. So I'm going to some of these questions that are great. One of them from Rachel Eisler was about applying culturally responsive teaching in an online learning format, K through 5. I know you touched on this a little bit, Debbie, but maybe you want to say a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question right now during the pandemic, of course, and it will be afterward as well, because I think some of us have really found that some students really like the opportunity to kind of be in the safety of whatever that means. I would be going crazy, just to say I am going a little crazy being home all the time, but I think the notion of culturally responsive practices is really important. And what I've had the privilege of, working with teachers across the country, and one of the most important things to do is to have that wonderful one-on-one conversation with students, and ask them very targeted questions around their assets and strengths, and their families as well. And for those of us who might be in a setting or we might not be familiar with the language, there's no harm in getting a translator, because the more we learn about our students and their interests and their desires and what their strengths are, the more we can match that with the curriculum we teach. For example, one of the teachers I worked with, their district does a lot of journal writing. And so journal writing is a kind of a goal of the district, to have kids do a lot of writing. And there are many students who really aren't comfortable writing in a journal online. Some of them are more comfortable writing in their native language by hand. Others want to be creative and create a podcast or a web, whatever. And the ideal is whatever we can tap into that really capture our students' interests is what helps them learn. We really want to support students' personal, social, and cultural interests, and that's what's going to spark and inspire learning.
That's a nice segue into another question that's come up a couple of times about building a library of resources within a school that will be helpful to the many cultures and languages represented. Do you have some advice to offer about that?
Oh, I always think that, if I walk into a school library, are there materials accessible and available to various multilingual, multicultural students? And the great news is that there are a lot of curated sites which give us good input around the topic that we're interested and what might be available for that curriculum area or subject matter that we're teaching, and also the students that we're teaching. Because so much of my work focuses on students that have lived with trauma, there are many curated sites that really look at multilingual, multicultural books that are available for students that really help them see themselves in others, or see what others have experienced, learn from that experience, see what people have experienced that have gone well, that haven't gone well. There are rich and wonderful resources available. It's just a matter of doing some research, asking colleagues in another school or district or in our own school what they've gathered. And sometimes, and in fact, a lot of times, families are wonderful resources too, because they may have come here with literature. Those that are literacy-oriented parents may be familiar with and have books that they've read to their children, and then their children literally age up and they're not using them anymore. And I know a lot of schools have collected books from families that have been donated.
Mm. I know there are an increasing number of wonderful books for kids that sometimes include other languages, but also that talk about language differences, which is
Yep,
helpful.
very
So
true.
that's another question that's come up a number of times is um, it's much more of a challenge to bridge that cultural gap if a teacher does not speak the first language of the student. And what are the best ways to overcome that? Again, I know this is something you've touched on throughout, but
Yeah, I think that's the biggest challenge for many of us, and I acknowledge that. What about me? I'm not familiar with the culture, the language, the experience. And, in my work over the past decades, I can't emphasize enough how helpful it is to really find someone who's bilingual, bicultural, and really represents the background experience of that student. And with the advent of, I want to say, the internet, it's become more, easier to do that. And I think once we've got access to that experience, what kinds of questions are helpful? And so what's helpful is to use strength-based questions that might be, tell me a little bit about your interests, tell me about a teacher you really liked, tell me about a learning environment that you did really well in, just all kinds of really focused strength-based questions that we provide a healthy amount in this book to
mm,
really help focus on that asset and strength connection.
um, another question that has come up a few times is that there needs to be more training in teacher education programs and other um, routes to the classroom about cultural differences and responsive teaching. Any thoughts about that?
I absolutely agree.
I thought you would.
Yeah, I do. For years, after long after I got my doctorate, I started teaching at the University of Massachusetts, and I had a really wonderful time for about a decade teaching a course called Managing Culturally Responsive Classrooms. This was years before there was a lot of research on it, and I used to approach the course by having, and I had the privilege of having a lot of pre-service and in-service teachers, and I always looked at, how could I engage my students or myself too, in issues of social justice, really looking at equity and areas that, would spark students' interest. And a theme that kept on popping up over the years were that students were really excited to look at that notion of responsive practices and what it meant for them from a social justice issue. For example, how many students are taking AP classes and who are those? Are they culturally diverse students or not? um, who's involved on, different teams and different after school events. So really looking at equity from a big picture. And I think that these courses, of which we wrote this book to be used in courses, are so important. And to give teachers that rich, or pre and in-service teachers, that rich experience of not just multilingual, but also multicultural. So Stephen Wang is a great example. He's an English speaker, but he's got this cultural background that's not necessarily a match with school. So books like mine and others, or books like Ivanya's and mine, and others, are really targeted for that need, and it is a very strong need.
Mm. Well, so here's a question that I love to end this webinar is, can I see the book again?
Oh, can you, do you see
I bet you have a copy there you can put
I
up in front
have?
of the
Yes,
camera.
because I used Stanley as an example right from this book.
I think one of the beginning slides also has a
Yes, and I think
picture.
our own slides.
There we
So
are.
I
Yeah.
want to compliment Norton. We had not, Vanya and I had nothing to do with the cover design, but we both saw it and we thought you did a wonderful job making this book
this cover.
beautiful. So thank you for asking that question. And thank you very much for hosting this. I really hope you've all found it helpful.
There are lots of very nice positive messages in the chat, and I think that's a wrap.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.